And it is my great pleasure today to introduce Donald Luskin. Don's successful 30-year career as an entrepreneur, executive, investment manager, and commentator has been built around his passion for the application of technology and innovation to the challenge of investing. He's currently the Chief Investment Officer at Trend Macro, previously held senior roles at Wells Fargo and Barclays. You may also know him from his role as a public intellectual. He's a frequent guest on Larry Kudlow's CNBC show. He's a contributing editor and columnist for the National Review Online and Smart Money. And I think most importantly, he's known for his National Review columns debunking our friend Paul Krugman. Donald is known as the leader of the Krugman Truth Squad. And his efforts have been so impactful that they've led to corrections by Krugman and even a tightening of the editorial policy from the New York Times. He is the author of I Am John Galt, which is a fantastic book. If you have not read it, we are selling it in our bookstore. And I now turn it over to Donald, whose topic today will be I Am John Galt, the dangerous fight for freedom today.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's certainly a momentous week for liberty this week, or lack thereof. I think we all did learn something very interesting yesterday from the Supreme Court ruling. Not a lot of people know this, but it's true. Did you know that everyone on Facebook is a constitutional law expert? And that's a good thing, because John Roberts isn't. So Aaron, thank you for that kind introduction and for having me here today. Thank you to the Atlas Society and the wonderful, wonderful work that you all do to keep the ideas of Ayn Rand front and center in the public mind. I have only one objection. Do we really have to have this meeting in Washington? You know, at least we're 2 stories below, so I feel safer right now than I normally do in this town. This is a dangerous town for people like us. We do not fit here, as you know. The people who fit here are people who have it in their nature to wish to rule. That is not our thing. We don't wish to rule. So Washington is like a negative Darwinian filter, where only the unfittest survive. Anyone who survives to rule in Washington is unfit to. And they don't want us here. They don't want us here because we bust the duopoly. As libertarians, as objectivists, we don't fit in neatly with the Democratic, Republican gang structure. We don't fit in with the people who want to take over your pocketbook. Neither do we fit in with the people who want to take over your sex life. So we are considered the very dangerous enemy of their game, and they will do some very, very nasty things to keep us out. So there are 2 reasons then why better people aren't in Washington, why better people aren't in government. One, it's because those of us who love freedom aren't naturally rulers. We don't want to do this. We just want to be ourselves. We don't want to command other people. But the other reason is that when any one of us does get close to power, the existing power structure will do extraordinarily cruel things to teach us a lesson, to make an example of us, to keep us out, and to make others like us fear to follow us. And I'm going to tell you a story of what happened to me when I took the risk of getting involved. I'm glad I did. I think I made a difference. But I paid a terrible price personally, and my family did too, and we will be paying that price forever. And it is the story of my involvement with Paul Krugman. Paul Krugman is an economist who is very, very, very welcome here. He's perfect. He's Washington's kind of man. He is a Nobel Prize winner. He is a best-selling author. He is a talking head who you see every Sunday on all the talk shows. But you know what? People like that are a dime a dozen. There are all kinds of spokespeople. But 10 years ago, Krugman was unique. When he first burst on the scene, when the idea of a credentialed, scholarly economist writing a very aggressive opinion column on the pages of the New York Times, that had just never been done before. This wasn't just a guy with an opinion. This was a scientist. This is somebody wearing the mantle of economic science. And so when he expressed a political opinion, it was a scientific judgment. And it made a real difference. It's kind of hard to remember that now. That's how Paul Krugman began 10 years ago. Now, does that remind you of anybody? I think the session, I wasn't present for the session this morning, but I believe it was generally on the subject of how the world we live in today is so much like the world of Atlas Shrugged. That's very true. But the world we live in today is also like the world of the Fountainhead. And if my description of Paul Krugman's life as an influencer is ringing any bells with you, it might be because he is exactly like the villain of the Fountainhead, Ellsworth Toohey. I mean, it's almost too eerie. Here's this newspaper columnist who's using his position as a public intellectual, as a newspaper columnist, somebody you wouldn't think would have that much power. But he uses it brilliantly. He pulls all the levers of the social structure at which, the center of which he stands at, and comes very close to destroying the hero Howard Roark and realizing his ambitions to rule the world. Now, Toohey is really the ideal Rand villain. The typical villain in movies is, you know, some giant satanic creature who's larger than life and very overtly threatening. Rand's villains are all sniveling little rat-faced gits who are really, you know, it's the heroes who are larger than life. And if you've ever met Krugman, sniveling little rat-faced git would come right to mind. He is, like Toohey, the physically deficient man who is brilliant, and as Freud said, anatomy is destiny, and so Toohey and Krugman believe it is their destiny to rule the world. Krugman definitely has an inferiority complex. He's on the record as saying he wishes he was a couple inches taller because he's just not imposing. A Newsweek article about him described him as gnomishly handsome. Is that like that character in the Game of Thrones? Is this a compliment? Okay, so how do you think that makes Krugman feel? Krugman's inner fantasy is not to be like that character on Game of Thrones. He believes he's like the science fiction character Harry Seldon. Have you ever read the famous Foundation trilogy by Isaac Asimov? I'm seeing a couple hands go up. Well, I'm going to ruin it for you. The idea of the Harry Seldon styles himself a so-called psychohistorian. And what we would call the Harry Seldons of the world today are econometricians, people with gigantic models where they just take every input, every piece of data that's available to them and predict the whole future of the economy. And in this science fiction trilogy, this Harry Seldon predicted and ultimately controlled the entire future of the galaxy. So let it never be said that Paul Krugman, this little gnomishly handsome man, doesn't have very big ambitions. He doesn't just want to rule the world, he wants to rule the galaxy. If you think I'm just making stuff up to make him seem peculiar, he is confessedly mad. I'm going to read you a quotation from one of his earlier autobiographical pieces on his Princeton website. My economic theories have no doubt been influenced by my relationship with my cats, quote unquote. You can't make this stuff up. Krugman, like Toohey, is an unabashed socialist. He says that he is and I quote again, he is an unabashed admirer of the welfare state. He wants, quote, a state that offers everyone who's underpaid an additional income. I want that. Like Toohey, Krugman is completely unscrupulous. He is a liar. No less an authority than Daniel Okrent, the first public editor or ombudsman for the New York Times, said, and I quote, Paul Krugman has the disturbing habit of shaping, slicing, and selectively citing numbers in a way that leaves him open to substantive assault. Now, in the Fountainhead was a very different book than Atlas Shrugged. Atlas Shrugged was a book where, it was a book about politics, really, not philosophy. It was a book where the good guys took concerted political action to change the world. The Fountainhead, in my reading, is really a book about philosophy. It's a book about the ultimate individualist, childlike artist, Howard Roark, who doesn't lift a finger to contend with Toohey at all. He just outlasts him. He just does his thing. He just wants to build his buildings. He doesn't care about leading a strike that'll change the world or overturning Ellsworth Toohey or anything else as building his beautiful buildings for his own sake. The greatest scene in the Fountainhead, I know anyone who's read it, you know what I'm going to say. It's when Toohey confronts Roark in a construction site of a building being put up by another architect when Toohey has almost ruined Roark's career, and Toohey, ever the second-hander, who doesn't have a sense of himself, requires others to give him a sense of himself, asks his arch enemy, Howard Roark, "Tell me in any words you choose, what do you think of me?" And Roark said, "But I don't think of you," and walked away. That's the way an Ayn Rand hero behaves. Now, me on the other hand, I'm working on it, okay? But I made a decision 10 years ago to think about Paul Krugman, a lot, and to take him on, and to try to make a difference. I decided that as an economist myself, I was mad as hell. I was not going to take it anymore. I just could not stand having this man use this discipline that I love, which I believe could someday be a science in the right hands, claiming that it is a science today and using that science to create political outcomes at all, and certainly ones that I so radically disagree with. I took it upon myself to see if I could take him down a peg or two. So set the Wayback Machine back to 2002. But before I tell you the story, can I get one thing out of the way? Anytime you read a critique of something Paul Krugman has written, they all begin the same way, right? The writer of the critique always starts by saying, well, first let me say that Paul Krugman is a great respected Nobel Prize-winning economist, but, well, I'm not going to give him that honor, okay? Fine, he won the Nobel Prize. Jimmy Carter won the Nobel Prize. Yasser Arafat won the Nobel Prize. Barack Obama won the Nobel Prize. The man who pioneered frontal lobotomies won the Nobel Prize. The German who invented Cyclone B nerve gas that liquidated 6 million Jews won the Nobel Prize for chemistry. This is no honor. The honor for an economist is the honor for any scientist, which is you have a hypothesis, you test it in the laboratory of the real world, and it's right. So let's think about some of the things that Paul Krugman predicted and see if they're right. Back in March 2000, when he had first started his New York Times columns, one of his first columns was saying, this is March 2000, remember, NASDAQ 5,000? He said, well, I'm not so sure the NASDAQ's really overvalued here. Now the Dow Jones, now that's overvalued. Well, the NASDAQ fell 85%. As you know, has barely recovered. The Dow Jones today is 20% higher than when Krugman wrote that. Believe it or not, Krugman used to be an economist within the Reagan White House. He wrote a paper in 1982 called The Inflation Time Bomb. We had a lot of inflation in this country in the 70s, and it peaked in 1980 and 1982. It had come down a bit. And Krugman co-authored with Larry Summers, no less, this paper predicting that inflation would go roaring back to where it had been before, and it would completely derail the Reagan recovery. You know where inflation went from there? Up to 1%. It turns to deflation. Absolutely wrong. When George Bush was president, Bush was spending too much money. You know, Krugman was right to criticize that, if for the wrong reasons. So he said, interest rates are going to go through the roof. Well, George Bush turns America into a banana republic. You've seen our deficits now that Bush is gone? Now, we're a banana republic that doesn't even have any bananas anymore. And Krugman is saying, don't worry about the debt. Don't worry about interest rates. Just spend more. The only thing wrong with the stimulus is we didn't spend enough. The truest thing that can be said about Paul Krugman's record as an economist was said by Paul Krugman himself. He said it, he blurted it out in a moment of weakness when he was in a TV debate with Bill O'Reilly, of all people. He said, compare my forecasting record with anyone else's, and I think you'll see it's not great. Ever the master of understatement. So I decided to fight. So now we're going to set the Wayback Machine to 2002. There was this new technology, which is all very commonplace now, called blogging. So I was trying to write a book. I was trying to write a book called The Conspiracy to Keep You Poor and Stupid. And I was going to put Paul Krugman at the center of the conspiracy. And I thought it would help me to write that book, to write a blog. And I thought all my blog postings could be sort of material for the book. Well, the blog took on a life of its own. I never wrote the book. But the blog got a lot of attention. And it turned into a National Review Online column called the Krugman Truth Squad. And the only thing wrong with the Krugman Truth Squad is I don't like the idea of having the word Krugman and the word truth next to each other. But other than that, we did some fine work. Now, the Krugman Truth Squad would, in today's modern social networking parlance, be called crowdsourcing. So what happened is twice a week, Paul Krugman's New York Times column would hit the online edition, and dozens of people in my network would all jump on it and take every sentence apart, fact check every statistic, chase down the original source of every quotation. And by the time morning, I would just stay up all night collating this stuff. Early in the morning, I'd submit this column to NRO, and while Krugman's column was flopping on the pavements of Manhattan, we had it completely cataloged and refuted, every lie, every misquotation, every statistical game, and it became a top 5 feature on National Review Online. Some amazing people contributed to the Krugman Truth Squad. Many are now superstar bloggers today. When you become recognized as a person who can get the word out on something important, like I was at the time, you get some amazing calls. I got calls from congressmen and senators giving me stuff that they wanted me to say in the column. I talked to Greg Mankiw, who's a great Harvard economist, author of the best-selling economics textbook. I met Ben Bernanke, thanks to the Krugman Truth Squad. Remember, whatever you may think of Ben Bernanke, he has one fantastic little item on his resume. He's the guy who hired Paul Krugman at Princeton. Great, let's put him in charge of the world. So we started the Krugman Truth Squad in early 2003. In April 2003, Krugman handed us an issue where we could really take this thing to the top. Krugman wrote a New York Times column, and this, back in March 2003, this was when the so-called Bush tax cuts were first being passed, first being hotly debated. They ended up passing in May. Krugman came up with this great talking point. He's saying, okay, we're doing $726 billion worth of tax cuts, and the Council of Economic Advisors says this will create 1.4 million jobs. So let me see. That's $500,000 per job. Boy, that's a lot to pay for a job. The average job in this country pays $40,000. Why are we doing this? Why don't we just give these people $500,000? If I heard that once, I heard that a million times. You can go search the congressional record. That was spoken on the floor of the Senate and the floor of the House by Democrats a zillion times. It was like a virus. And isn't that how Ellsworth Toohey operated? He got these ideas out in print, and then they just got repeated through the echo chamber of Washington. But, you know, great talking points, they may make Krugman what we called at the time America's most dangerous liberal pundit, and he certainly was. But the problem with these talking points is that they're often not true. But that doesn't mean they're not going to get repeated, because like the New York Times says about great news stories, they're just too good to fact check. Now, what is the lie about Krugman's simple arithmetic of these tax cuts costing the taxpayer $500,000 per job created? What's wrong about it is it doesn't sound wrong at all if you say it fast. It's just simple math. But here's the problem. The $726 billion number is over the 10-year forecasted life of the tax cuts. The 1.4 million jobs created were to be created in the first year. So you want to divide it by 10. So the future Nobel Prize-winning economist forgot to divide by 10. And this went into the New York Times. It got repeated a million times in the congressional record. Now, did he forget? Well, it turns out that 2 months earlier, he'd made that same point on a television interview on PBS. And strike me dead for saying this, but God bless PBS, because Jeff Colvin, the host on the PBS show that was interviewing him, didn't miss a beat. He instantly said, "But Professor Krugman, isn't that a 10-year cost? Aren't you forgetting to divide by 10? And Krugman says, "Well, yeah. And so when he repeats that in the New York Times 2 months later, you can't call it a mistake, because the mistake was brought to his attention, if it was ever a mistake. When you willfully repeat a mistake, what do we call it? A lie! So the Krugman True Squad just went nuts on this, and it became, and the battle over this became our most read columns, and Krugman himself made a really stupid mistake. He responded to us. He posted no fewer than 10 responses on his own website at Princeton. He didn't have a blog then as he does now. And these responses just became increasingly nonsensical and desperate. In one of them, when he's in a disagreement with somebody over an intellectual issue, his technique is he always attacks them personally, and more on that later. But his jab at me was to call me his stalker-in-chief. And I suppose, if that means following somebody around and threatening them, if there's an intellectual analogy to the crime of actually stalking, okay, that's fair. That's funny. So he never admitted the error, still hasn't. But it made a phenomenon out of the Krugman True Squad, and Krugman was getting a lot of publicity. He had a book coming out, so he was appearing on a lot of TV shows, and every time he would appear on TV, whoever was interviewing him would be prepped by his staff, and they'd be given a bunch of Krugman True Squad columns, and it was always, "Hey, well, this Krugman True Squad thing says this about that. What do you say to that, Professor Krugman?" So we became a real thorn in his side. Now, in October of the same year, 2003, I had an opportunity to meet him. I live out in California. A guy, an old Ayn Rand, Brandon Institute guy, older man, in retirement in San Diego, just reached out to me out of the blue, and this is the great thing about doing these blogs. You really do meet interesting people. And said, Krugman's doing his book tour down here at the University of San Diego. I've always wanted to meet you, Don, and why don't you just be my guest, come to this book tour, and we'll sit in the audience and laugh at Krugman. So I got on a plane, and I went down there, and my new friend and I had this idea that at the end, remember this is a book tour, so at the end, Krugman was standing on the stage signing the books. Oh, hey, that brings a thought to mind. There's a pile of my books out in the back, and so my friend and I get in line, and I have to say it was with some trepidation that I would stand directly in front of Paul Krugman. It's not because I was afraid of him in any way, it's because of the experience I had listening to his speech before the signing. Now, how many people remember well The Fountainhead? Read it recently. Do you remember good. Do you remember the scene in which Ellsworth Toohey first appears in the book? He appears giving a speech. And two other characters in the book are in the audience for the speech, and it's such an overflow occasion. They're actually out in the street listening to him on a loudspeaker, so they can't even see him. And so we don't know yet that he's this physically puny little fellow. We just hear this powerful, booming voice issuing this clarion call to socialism. And the two characters listening to this in this crowd that's just boiled up by Toohey's speech get this unaccounted for sense of dread, and they end up fleeing the scene. Well, when I was in this audience listening to Krugman, I didn't want to stick around and get his autograph. I wanted to flee the scene. The nabob from the University of California who introduced him to the podium gave his bio information, and then when bringing him up said, "God bless Paul Krugman." And the audience hung on his every word. And if you've ever seen Krugman on TV, you know that he kind of talked like this. Well, when he's live in front of an audience that adores him, his voice is like Ellsworth Toohey. Rand described it as a velvet banner. This was scary stuff. So, went up after that, stood in line. I knew he'd have no reason to know what I look like or who I am, so I'm just another guy in line in San Diego. He's scratching out these illegible signatures and conveyor belt of people. Gets to me, and I say, "Would you mind inscribing yours to me personally?" He says, yeah, all right. "What's your name?" I said, "Don," and he writes, "Don Luskin, L-U," and when he gets to the S, he looks up at me. and it's like the Richard Nixon eyes start. And so he finishes it, and he says, yeah, all right, get out of here. So I went to my hotel room and did a blog posting about the experience where I described everything I just told you. I woke up the next morning, and I discovered that I don't know if it exists anymore or not, but there was a extremely powerful, influential liberal blogger operating at the time who used the pseudonym Atrios. He has since been outed as another economics professor, actually. His blog was called Eschaton. And he had linked to my blog post with but a single line that had the link, where if you clicked on it, you get to my blog post. And that line said, "Diary of a Stalker." Well, now I'm going from being stalker-in-chief, intellectual stalker, being an actual stalker. That's kind of alarming. But, you tell yourself any publicity is good publicity. Did they spell my name right? So then a couple days later, Krugman's on the Hannity and Colmes show. And Hannity asks him a tough question based on something or other that I'd written. And Krugman says, "Oh, yeah, well, that guy. He's the guy who used to stalk me online and once stalked me personally." So here's a guy on national television accusing me of a felony, and it's a felony that is associated with really crazy people. And that is the definition of libel. And it's really quite alarming to hear that on TV. But what really made it bad was what happened next. I don't know if any of you spend a lot of time on blogs, but one of the features of blogs is that many of them have a comment section below, where people who read the blog can add their little opinions. This one-line Atrios blog post, Diary of a Stalker, as soon as Krugman went on TV, thousands of comments started accruing below that blog that involved absolutely the most horrifying, defamatory comments about me, suggestions about what should be done to me, statements about my family from people who've never even met my family. It was an absolutely horrifying experience. And the worst part was where somebody somehow used some combination of the web and government records to find out where my daughter, who was then 7 years old, went to elementary school, published that information online, and said, "Go get her." So that's what they do to you. That's what they do to you. And that's what they do to you if you just buy their goddamn book and have them sign it. So I figured it was all part of the game. My wife did not take it so well. She was extraordinarily alarmed by this, and I don't blame her. This was my game, and she was paying the price for it. So I had a lawyer write a demand letter to Atrios saying, "You've got to shut down this comment section and take these things all down." Well, Atrios' only response was simply to publish the letter verbatim. And that's when the shit really hit the fan. Because then, not only was I a stalker, I was an enemy of the First Amendment. Doesn't the Constitution guarantee people a right to make death threats against my daughter? This became I suppose one of these 15 minutes of fame things. But for 15 minutes, 15 days, it became a cause celeb in the political blogosphere in which everybody had an opinion, left and right, and everybody had the same opinion, which was that I was Satan. Even National Review wouldn't stand up for me, and they dropped the Krugman Truth Squad column. It's too hot to handle. And so, if you believe that any publicity is good publicity and all you want is for them to spell your name right, sometime if you're ever in the archives of the New Yorker magazine, search for my name, and you'll find an article about me. You know, when I was a kid, I had literary ambitions, and the New Yorker was the top of the pyramid. And I either wanted to write for the New Yorker or be one of those people who gets written about in the New Yorker. Well, I got written about in the New Yorker. I got my dream, except I got written about for being a stalker. And that, and all the blog posts, and all the commentary, and all those comments on Atrios, they're all still there. So, if I ever want to, I'm glad at the moment I don't need this, but if I ever need to apply for a job, forget it. I'm not hireable. And that's the price I paid for getting involved. And that's why we are all here in this basement. And 2 levels up are a bunch of cretins who rule us. It's because this is a dangerous town. Now, what did we get for this? Up to that point, I'd only been doing this for a year and a half. Eventually, things calmed down. NRO reinstated the Krugman Truth Squad. My wife calmed down. So I thought, you know what, I've already paid the maximum price, so why not get something good for this? So I started asking myself the question, why, with the Krugman Truth Squad having documented so many egregious lies and errors in Krugman, including this divide by 10 thing, why has none of this been corrected in the New York Times? Now, if you guys read the New York Times, you know that one of its funny little idiosyncrasies is that it will do corrections on the most trivial errors from like 50 years ago. Somebody will come, some society lady will come up and say, oh no, at that party I was drinking Darjeeling tea, not Earl Grey. You must correct this. And they do. But until I got involved, the editorial page never did corrections. They had no corrections policy. Why? Because the editorial page reports to the publisher. The rest of the magazine, the newspaper, reports to the editor. The editor has nothing to do with the editorials. It's a funny semantic disjunction there. Now, sure, if an editorial writer is found making an error, he could correct it. But human nature being what it is, they never do. And why should they? Credibility is their stock in trade. You never admit an error if you don't have to, because then everybody will wonder about everything else you say. So then along came a fellow named Jason Blair. Anybody remember that name? Jason Blair was a young African-American man who was brought into the New York Times as part of an affirmative action program and filed a bunch of stories from for the Times that turned out to be just basically completely fabricated. And those things that he filed with the Times that weren't fabricated were plagiarized. So he was discovered and eventually had to leave, and it was a big scandal for the newspaper of record. And in the wake of it, they hired this Daniel Okrent to be their first public editor, their first ombudsman. And I made it my mission to get inside this guy's mind and get him to be the guy who would put in place an editorial page corrections policy. So I started an email correspondence with him, and we kind of got to like each other and know each other. I went to meet him in New York, and I knew I had him when the very first thing he says when he sees me is, "You're much better looking than Paul Krugman." Oh, come on, everybody is. But the more important thing he said in that meeting was, they call the New York Times the newspaper of record. My contract as public editor is for 18 months. At the end of those 18 months, if anybody still thinks that the New York Times is a newspaper of record, I will have failed. I like that. So I started working with this guy, and we ended up getting a corrections policy for the first time on the editorial page. It took about a year it took about a year of his 18-month tenure, but we did it. And it was a halfway step. The policy was that when an error was discovered, that in the columnist's subsequent column, he was to mention it in the text. Okay, so what's wrong with that? One, it doesn't require that it be identified as an error, just mentioned. And two, in the archives, and now, online, everything's an archive, the original column that contained the error is not flagged as containing an error. So if you see the column that has an error, and then somehow you skip, say, 5 columns forward where you see the error mentioned, you might put 2 and 2 together and realize that was an error. But if not, it just stands forever. But it was the best we could do. So Okrent moves on. A new public editor comes in. Big mistake. They hired this guy from the Wall Street Journal. What were they thinking? His name is Byron Kalame, Barney to his friends. So Krugman made a particularly egregious lie. He made a fairly easily fact-checkable statement that all of the simulated recounts of the contested Florida 2000 presidential election show that Bush would never have won. Well, that's just simply not true. And I jumped through quite a few hoops to get testimony from the Miami Herald and others who were involved in actually carrying out those recounts to prove him wrong, and funneled all that on a daily basis to Barney. And Barney managed to lever that into a new columnist corrections policy where now corrections have to appear at the bottom of the in a separate box on the editorial page, just like regular corrections. The original erroneous column has to be flagged in the archive as having a correction. So now editorial page corrections are just like any correction in the New York Times. Now, why is this important? It's important because the New York Times, as you know, is absolutely, using its unearned but nevertheless existent credibility, it is an extremely powerful liberal mouthpiece that gets to put out ridiculously partisan, democratic biased, liberal biased, socialist biased opinions, all under the masthead of the newspaper of record, read around the world, influencing the agenda of other newspapers, blah, 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 blah. If you take away their ability to lie, it turns out they have nothing to say. And what we've learned now with Krugman is that, oh yeah, he's still out there. He's got a best-selling book. He's on the George Stuff and Envelopes show, and he's a star. But he is not what he was 10 years ago. He's not producing talking points to get repeated endlessly in the Washington echo chamber because he can't lie anymore. And so when the Bush tax cuts expired for the second time on December 31st, 2010, they were extended for another 2 years, really without very much of a fight, by a Senate that was controlled by Democrats, a House that was controlled by Democrats, and a President who is a Democrat. The 2003 Bush tax cuts, which squeaked through the Senate with 50 votes and a tiebreaker by the dreaded Satan, Dick Cheney, were reaffirmed by an all-Democratic government, and there was nothing Krugman could do to stop it. And when I saw the news that the Bush tax cuts had been extended, and I was glad because I don't like paying higher taxes, and I think it's better for growth to have lower taxes, but I was particularly thinking about how impotent Paul Krugman must feel that the thing he fought so hard to prevent initially has now been repeated by his own partisan brothers. So what this goes to show is you can fight the power, you can make the difference, but like everything else in life, you will pay a price. Now, in this particular endeavor, the price you will pay is that you will put yourself in contention with people who have literally infinite power. If you take it all the way up to the reductio ad absurdum, you take on people in this town, you are taking on people who can press a red button that will end life on earth. They can certainly audit your taxes. They can certainly slander you with impunity. But if it's a value to you, if that's what you want to do, if you want to be like Howard Roark, but the building you want to build is to achieve making a difference in public discourse, if that's your thing, and you're willing to pay the price, and in the Fountainhead, Howard Roark certainly paid various prices for his art. So if your art, if you want to get involved, go ahead and do it. Just go up 2 flights. But don't forget, this town is all about power. That's all government is. Government is a gun. And that's not something people like us are used to dealing with. We like the power of this weapon in here. This is the power of voluntary persuasion, of leadership and followership that are a mutually agreed bond between free people. Power does not enter into it. But if you want to pay the price and take on the power, it is possible to win. If any of you have any questions, I'd be delighted to take them.
Don, thank you very much, and we need to have awards for courage. Maybe the Atlas Society can think about doing that on an annual basis. I'll contribute the first $1 if there's a monetary prize. There was an old Paul Krugman, and one of his positions was he defended sweatshops. And I've noticed some people that have said, including economist Robert Murphy, who in a different sense is trying to challenge Krugman, that he changed at some point. And, the ego, there's a lot of psychological analysis you can do, but Krugman changed when he got his mouthpiece at the New York Times.
I agree completely. There are 2 Paul Krugmans. There's the pre-Times and the post-Times, and there's being an economist and being a public intellectual are not the same thing. When you're an economist, you are peer-reviewed by other economists, and your success as an economist is largely measured by the number of citations you get in subsequent papers by credentialed economists. Krugman decided that it was easier to get citations by Barney Frank.
Hi, it's obvious you have no love for Paul Krugman. But my question is, whenever he did nationally attack you, committed libel against you, why was it that you did not take more aggressive action towards him?
I looked into it in great detail. In fact, I engaged an attorney, in fact, who's the only attorney who has ever gotten a libel award out of the National Enquirer. So I figure someone who can deal with the National Enquirer can certainly deal with the New York Times. But thanks to one of the externalities of the First Amendment is that libel law creates an extremely strong presumption in favor of the defendant, the person accused of having committed the libel. And so very, very large costs have to be borne by the plaintiff, and there are all kinds of, there are many knockout processes before it even gets in front of a judge. So I made the decision that some drawn-out victory that would cost me $1 million in legal fees and get me a symbolic award of $1, like General Westmoreland got from the New York Times, better uses of my money.
Thank you. Is the Truth Squad back in business, or are you guys retired forever? And are you going to pick up any more windmills to chase?
I don't think I've written a Truth Squad column for about 3 years now. I don't want us, the 2 most costly words in politics are mission accomplished. But I feel like I did enough, and it's extremely time consuming, and it's not remunerative. except psychically. So I let it go.
I would just like to thank you for crushing that idiot, basically. And I was wondering why he would think that bringing our spending levels up to that of Greece would possibly help us. Because I read in an article from him to Bernanke, that our government spending GDP level, or relative to the GDP, were far too low, and that he thinks that we need to increase it exponentially. And I was wondering if you could shed any light on the possible logic behind that.
I think it's a form of opportunism where in a weak economy, people are desperate enough to try any crazy thing, and he wants to increase the role of government. And so that almost means by definition increasing government spending. So this is his moment, and he's got all these fancy Keynesian charts and graphs to justify it, but basically it's just his ideological agenda. He wants government to be bigger, and this is his Reichstag fire. This is how he wants to seize power. I have another darker theory, which is I'm a big believer that many people in public life are in various ways sort of built on the mental model of Dr. Strangelove. You look like you're maybe too young to have seen that movie, but Dr. Strangelove is a black comedy from 1964 directed by Stanley Kubrick, in which the character Dr. Strangelove is one of these sort of Cold War game theory guys about mutually assured destruction and deterrence and all this stuff. And as the movie unfolds, and you realize that basically everybody in the power structure is just a complete psycho in one way or another, it turns out that Dr. Strangelove's thing is he actually wants there to be a nuclear war, because he wants the human population to be drastically reduced. He wants the elite of government in America to exist for 30 years while the fallout dissipates in mine shafts. And he's got this thing all figured out where in order to repopulate America, it'll be necessary to have a male to female relationship of 1 to 10. And they've just got this thing all figured out where they, in their position, as one of the few who will survive and get to live in the mine shafts with their harems, will be better off. And as the Air Force general, played by George C. Scott, said in just one of the greatest lines in movies, let me get this straight, Doctor. Wouldn't that mean we'd have to give up the so-called monogamous sexual relationship?
You talked a lot about the widespread influence of the New York Times and getting the corrections portion. It was a big victory for you. So, the trend seems to be moving away from one media outlet having a lot of control with the internet and that sort of thing. So, what do you see as being the next step for a sort of fact check on a widespread dispersion of media outlets as people start getting their information from so many different sources that being able to fact check all of the different information you can get news-wise seems to be a tall task. So what do you see as the next step in providing a fact check or corrections portion to news as we see it today?
Well, to me, the ultimate undisciplined media bath that you can just drown yourself in is Twitter. You get, now I happen to like it, and the reason I like it is because it is Marshall McLuhan's global village. When tweets are coming in, they're just cascading in, you're able to read them all while you're sitting there because they're only 140 characters each, and you're exposed to all kinds of extremely brief opinions, claims, lies, truths. And in that kind of environment, you aren't dependent on anybody else but yourself to figure out what has the ring of truth. And I find that I find it's just a skill that you can acquire, and it's a skill that the people who lived in the Soviet Union when their only news outlet was Pravda had to acquire. We need someone to fact check the New York Times because there's this lie that what's in the New York Times is true, so it needs to be fixed. But if you just start by believing that it's all just a bunch of guys in their pajamas tweeting to you, and probably most of it's not true anyway, then why does it need to be corrected? So from a libertarian or objectivist standpoint, I'd say set aside any collectivist notion that there's any big mommy and daddy news outlet in the sky that's ever going to fix this for you and bring you the truth. You're just going to have to find out the truth yourself, and the best starting position is just to assume there is none.
This is a little off topic of your talk. I'm just curious about the book that you've written, what kind of reception you've received with the title, I Am John Galt, and has it gotten any kind of significant reaction, positive or negative? And have you had any hassles about using the characters in the title?
No, I've had only the lightest contact with the Rand estate, and none of it's it's all been moderately congratulatory, but no, certainly nothing like an endorsement, and no hassle at all. And various organizations like this one have been reasonably embracing, but it's you haven't seen it on the New York Times bestseller list, have you?
Well, good luck with it.
Thank you.
Hi. Obviously, you're a very outspoken objectivist, and presumably you also live with objectivist values personally. I was wondering how you see the difference, if there is any, and how you juggle or differentiate between the two, outspoken and internal.
Wow, what a profound question. Guy, I hope there's no difference. The internal is inevitably more complicated. I get 24 hours a day with myself. I only get an hour with you, so I have to pick my spots. But just to be clear, I don't consider myself an objectivist. I don't consider myself any kind of ist. I'm just me. And I recommend that. Not that you be me, I like you.
You've issued this call to arms, this warning going along with it about the things that can happen to you, and one of them you say is that you became unhireable. Now,
are you from Goldman Sachs, and are you going to prove me wrong?
No. But if people are going to take that kind of a risk, it helps to know how you can survive it. And so I'll ask, therefore, that you tolerate my asking a rather intrusive question, and that is, how do you get past that to the point where you're worried about your taxes being too high?
Right. Okay, good question. Well, I have a couple of luxuries coming into this. One is that before any of this even happened, I'd already had a pretty long career that had been pretty successful, and I'd had a number of what we call out in Silicon Valley liquidity events. So I wasn't going to die for lack of work, but also I've managed to create a small four-person firm that I run that my clients are institutional investors, and I provide advice, strategic advice to them. So you could say I'm an investment advisor to other investment advisors, and that is I have 72 clients, and so that's a network of 72 bilateral relationships. And they know who I am, they know what I am, and they know me well enough to know that when it comes to telling them whether Greece is going to default or not, then I'm giving that opinion as an investor and a strategist, not out of any kind of political belief. So, fortunately, I've been able to make that second career on my own. The problem comes when there are some people who do certain kinds of work, or perhaps are just the kind of people who need to work in large firms, and large firms will hesitate to take the reputation risk. So if you've got some way you can earn a fairly independent living, that's a great blessing.
I just have a question about Krugman that has always been on my mind since I've been following him maybe the last decade or so. Why is he even
relevant? You've just been following him, right?
Yes.
Not stalking
yes.
him. Okay.
Well,
okay.
why is he even relevant? I can't understand why he wasn't marginalized a long time ago and just off to do his own thing in academia.
Well, he is so important because he is useful to people in power. He generates and validates talking points that they can use. And however corrupt and duopolized our system is, it nevertheless is still at least a competition between the two members of the duopoly. They do fight things out. In most cases, there are lesser of two evils to choose from, even though they're both evil. So in those debates, both sides need intellectuals who can generate intellectual ammunition for them that they can use to sway hearts and minds and each other. I see nobody standing in front of the microphone. I guess that means it's time for lunch. Thank you.